presentation. Julianne and I, along with Jacob Weaver-Spidell, this summer had the opportunity to go on a bus tour with a group of congregations through a program called Thriving Together. Some of you maybe have heard about this. We started about a year ago, but our racial justice working group here at the church had applied to be a part of this program with Drew Hart, who's a professor at Messiah University. And working with Messiah, they have created this program through a Lilly grant where they reach out to provide, I think there's 12 churches in this cohort. They did it once before, and we are a part of this cohort with 12 other churches. And we've been meeting, let's say, every other month, basically for about a year, gathering together to meet and talk about race and place, specifically about kind of the situation in our own communities, doing some historical research. And you may have heard some of the different things that have been happening within the life of this congregation through the work of our racial justice working group. One of the big events of this Thriving Together program was to go on this week-long bus tour through some civil rights spots. So Jake's unable to be with us this morning, but Julianne and I are going to talk about part of the trip. We decided as we present this information to not just go through kind of like exactly the order that we did the bus trip, but instead to try and frame this in some sort of historical chronology. So we might jump from location to location on our trip as we try to talk about some of the things that have happened. We have some pictures from our time together. We're going to share some of our own reflections as well as allow for us as a group to have some conversation together about part of the trip. Julianne, I don't know if you want to say anything to start before we get into the Virginia.
Just a little bit.
Sure.
As Jason said, we're going to go by chronological order of the way the events happened in history, not the way we saw them on our trip. And it was very helpful to me at the beginning of the trip. Well, in the first place, we were on the bus for a long time. And all the time we were on the bus, there were documentary videos or historical fiction videos about the time being shown. It was a real immersion experience for us. We're going to try to give as much of that to you this morning as possible. So you're sitting like you were on the bus.
Only we didn't have 4 across on the
right. So this is to help you. These are things that were happening at the time that you probably are aware of. Of course, there was slavery here in this time period, lynchings in Jim Crow in this time period, and then specific years. This is where Brown versus Board of Education. Decision was made by the Supreme Court. Emmett Till was murdered in 1955. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, thank you, was formally incorporated here in 1956, although it's kind of started it the year before that. There was a Civil Rights Act in 1957, which I didn't know about, that Eisenhower had signed, pretty much under duress. He was not an integrationist. Then we're going to skip a few years, 1961. SNCC is a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and they were working a lot on voter registration at this time. 1963, of course, Kennedy was killed. 64, Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. 1965, the Voting Rights Act, and 1968 then. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. So that, I think you know most of those things. You've heard them. I had heard a lot of those things before. I knew a lot about each of them, but I had to put them in context. That's chronological order. And the first video that we saw on the bus really did that for us. That was very helpful. So we wanted to try to provide that for you too here. These are the things we actually did and saw. We're going to try to do the first 4 of them this morning. And the first one was at the University of Virginia. that happened also to be the first stop we made on the way south. But they have there a memorial to enslaved laborers. Paper here.
And that's the image you see on the screen now.
That's the image you see on the screen. Before we get into the specific of that photo, the place that we were, I'd like you to use your imagination, get immersed in this situation, and imagine yourself. I'm going to take a chance here. Imagine yourself being here in a culture that you know, a language that you know, a well-developed culture, and some oligarchs from the other side of the world come and make a deal with Donald Trump. They need laborers, unskilled laborers. And so they make this arrangement with Donald Trump, and he gets a lot of money for it, and he sends these people off to other countries where they don't know the language, you don't know the language, and you don't know the culture. And you are highly skilled, perhaps, and have to do just unskilled labor, and are punished severely if you're not doing it. Now think of Africans, or this isn't a perfect analogy, but think about Europeans, wealthy Europeans, going to Africa, making deals with leaders there, or to sell some of their people. Them being packed up on a ship like cargo and being transported across the ocean. You might have died at that point. You made the trip, you get here, you were enslaved, and you had to do what your slaver told you to do. Hope that makes it feel a little bit personal for you. Note that it's called, and they're called the Memorial to Enslaved Laborers. They're not slaves. They're called enslaved laborers, which allows for the dignity and the personhood of those people, not just slaves. Then, if you were one of these slaves that came across, you would find yourself in a new culture, and a culture that was pretty highly developed at the time. Jefferson had been president. He was a visionary. He was a man of ideas, and he had slaves. One of the things that one of his ideas was to have this university. Of course, the university was only for wealthy white students. But he had this idea, and he wanted to implement it. And the way he implemented it was to use slaves for the unskilled part of it. So, people were enslaved up until, of course, the end of the Civil War in 1865. The University of Virginia was started in 1817. And they were Jefferson used that slave labor to build it. From 1817, of course, till the end of 1817 to the end of 1855. But then after 1855, there still were not Black students at the university. Until the 1930s, some Blacks started to apply for admittance. But it wasn't until the 1970s that Blacks were regularly admitted to the university. So those Black students started to agitate, so to speak, for some way to acknowledge the university's dependence on slavery historically. In the information we were given, it says that they wanted to acknowledge the work and individual lives of the enslaved Americans, African Americans, who built the University of Virginia and sustained daily life from its founding, and to acknowledge both the pain of their bondage and their hope for the future. This memorial took a long time to develop. In 1987, we're getting into 170 years after the founding of the university, there was a vision started by a formal report submitted to UVA's president. But it wasn't until 20 years later, in 2007, that the university issued a statement stating its particular regret for the university's employment of enslaved persons, and they installed a plaque. First step, but it wasn't enough for this group of students that was working at this memorial. So a President's Commission on the University and Slavery was founded in 2013. And it began conversations about truth telling and repair. And they recommended the construction of a memorial. That's what you see here in the photo. In 2016, there was a design team chosen. They listened very well to all the parties involved, and they came up with this finally in the spring of 2020. Of course, that's when COVID hit. So it wasn't dedicated until the following year. It's a long time to be working at something like this. So let me tell you something about the design of it, because the design was very carefully made. What you see here is a circle that's 80 feet in diameter, which is exactly the same size as the rotunda on campus. It was built as part of the original campus. It's made of granite, blocks of granite that were locally mined. Do you mine granite? Quarry granite, thank you. On the wall, when you get closer, why don't you show that? There are names of enslaved people. More than 4,000 enslaved people worked there in these years between 1619 and 1865. When we were there, we were lined up. There were about 40 of us. We were lined up in a single line right in front of that wall. And on the wall are engraved the names of the enslaved people, some of them first and last names, some of them only first names, some of them no names at all, just a stonemason, bricklayer. And we were asked, our guide, I was going to ask you a question, Jason, but you weren't there.
Yeah.
He joined the group a day late. This was our first day. Our guide was a Black woman who, if I remember correctly, said that she had graduated from the university. Her daughter was now a student at the university. One of her parents had worked at the university, not in academia, but as a laborer. So there was a definite increase in what their family had been able to do. We were asked, she was standing out on that grassy area, which is the center of the circle. And she asked us to turn around and look at the wall and then place a hand on whatever name was closest. And think of that person as an individual. And then she had each of us say the name of the person whatever name we were touching, we would say that name. And so we went, all 40 of us, one at a time, around that circle, naming this.
Julie, in clarification, were those 4,000 people individuals, enslaved people that worked at UVA? at the university.
Either helped to build the actual buildings of the
Or through
university
the years.
or took care through the years of the daily life of the university.
But we're not allowed to be students.
That's
through
right.
all this.
That's right. So we also had that circle in the center has dates and events all along the edge of it. It's like a timeline, circular timeline. And it's also a water feature. So there's a trough of water along the edge of it that covers that. So the water is flowing over the events that are named. And we stood there and read, not all of them, but she asked us to read particular ones. I mean, who will read such and such, she would say. and we took turns reading and thought about those people as individuals and remembered them. Be sure, I told you everything I wanted to tell you about that.
Is there, the size of the stones are different as it goes around?
Yes, it is.
Is that significant?
It is, and I'm not quite sure what the significance. Well, I know part of it. It's on a slope. So if you were on the outside of it, at the highest point, it's only 5 feet high. If you're on the inside, it's 8 feet high. And the significance of that is that when Jefferson built the pavilions that are around the main campus, facing a lawn, what they call the lawn with a capital L, you see what you see if you stand in front of those, in front of the building, the pavilion, you see a 2-story building. But if you go around the back, because it's built on the slope, the basement under those would open out onto level ground. The basement is where the slaves lived. Jefferson wanted to keep those slaves concealed as much as possible. He knew slavery wasn't right. So this kind of illustrates that. With the outside of it being the higher ground where the pavilions would have been, and then the inside being with the basement where the slaves were. So that is significant. Thank you for asking that.
And do they talk about how they identified all these people?
Jefferson kept his records of everything that he did. That's all I would have to say about that.
Right.
Except for one thing, as I did a little bit of a immersion kind of thing here at the beginning with you, but as we were talking about all the different events that were and things that we saw, try to think about yourself. Where were you at the time things were happening if you were born? Think about what you might have done. Think about when if you didn't know about it at the time, why, if you didn't, I forgot what the question I was going to ask you. If you didn't, if you weren't aware of it at the time, why not? And what would you have done if you had been aware? Think about some of those things as we go through all these, and we'll kind of get some sharing going later. Okay.
So we're still in this time period of kind of deep American history. We'll be talking about things that happened long before some of us were, well, before any of us were born. So one of the areas that we went to, and this is our group, this is the 3 of us, this is the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. It's interesting, when we took this picture, you know, we were excited to be there. And one of our group leaders, Brian, was like, I'm sure if we took this picture afterwards, you wouldn't be smiling. And it was so true. Kind of the heaviness of when we left. It feels weird to look at this picture now and think of us before we went in, just kind of like, hey, here we are, we're about to do that. So as Julianne mentioned, Ashley and I were at a festival the week before. It's called Wild Goose Festival. And we were there, and this bus trip left Sunday morning. We were down in North Carolina that day. We drove down to South Carolina to the hotel that this group was staying at the first night. So I met up with the group on the first night of the bus trip after they drove all the way down because I was already in the South. But I did miss that first day. I'm not sure what day of the trip this was on. It was a little later in the trip. This is memorial to the countless and unknown number of individuals who suffered at the hands of violence in the form of lynchings. And so as you come into the museum, this was probably one of the most just beautifully artistic, kind of the way that everything was laid out. It was just a really, really powerful and moving a place to be. And if any of you are ever in Montgomery, I would encourage you to visit these 3 sites that we'll be talking about today. But as you kind of walk up, there's a little bit of history and things on the walls, some sculptures depicting, I guess you could think of this as being almost in Africa before coming to the States. And as you come in, there is a number of these hanging, well, they don't start hanging. These are on the ground, kind of affixed to the ground. And each one of these slabs contains the name of a county, as well as the name of individuals who were lynched in that county. Each one of these slabs usually contains multiple names. Some of them only maybe contain one name. But as you start to walk into this memorial, the floor slowly starts to drop out. And so you are walking amongst these slabs, and as you come down, it lowers as a ramp, and then you find yourself standing with all of these memorials above you, which is a really powerful experience to walk through, because as you're descending down the ramp, you kind of have this feeling, it's not an accident that these are designed in a way to feel like bodies that are hung. And so as you come through, they slowly start to rise above you. And it kind of creates this feeling about your place within this, your role within this. It's aesthetically beautiful, but it's representative of just such incredible atrocity. And again, each one of these has multiple names on them. Some of them have just full states that are listed on them. And as you work your way through, you see all of these names and dates, and many of them just say, you can't see here, but just say unknown, 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 unknown. So there's evidence that these lynchings took place, but probably not enough care from the people at the time to even bother to record the names of individuals. There's a number of these signs along the side. Yeah.
I would think of these happening in the South, but is that limited, or where else? Did they happen in the North and the West as well, or?
So primarily in the South, but there were some in Pennsylvania. There's largely out West. Lynchings happened all over the place, but I think it's fair to say it was primarily in the South for a couple reasons, largely because of that's where the Black population was for the most part. There were, of course, Black people all over the states, but concentrated in the South because of slavery.
So there were counties in California and Nevada as well?
Yeah, I don't know if we saw any. I'm trying to remember California, but yeah, they would list all sorts of different states and counties. And there's like kind of a master list, I think, that existed somewhere.
May I say the story? There was no rhyme or reason as to how they were hung. So you couldn't go, there was not alphabetical order or anything like that. So you couldn't go in there and say, I want to find such and such a county and find it easily. You had to look and look. And I think they did that purposely because they didn't want somebody just coming in there and looking for that one name or that one place. They wanted you to look, to recognize all of these names, to really look at all of these memorial. And I was looking for Bamberg County, South Carolina, because that's where Eddie grew up. And I walked for 3/4 of the way through there and had not found it, and my neck was hurting me because I was looking up so much. And then there was a docent that helped me to find Bamberg. She said, no, she didn't know where it was, but she said, I'll look. And probably 10, 15 minutes later, she found me, so I found it. There were 3.
Jason, it's interesting, all these unknowns that you just mentioned, would that reflect the time that these people had no worth
Right.
and no name, right?
Right, yeah. And they'll be quick to say that there are plenty of people that are just like, who knows, like unaccounted for lynchings that
Sure.
weren't publicly recorded in any kind of way. Because going back, you have to look at historical records that exist. And there were certainly countless of these incidents that happened that had no, because it was.
So these lynchings were all public.
Most of them were,
Again,
not all of them. Some of them were
Okay.
private. But you'll see here as an example, Fred Rochelle, 16, was burned alive in a public spectacle lynching before thousands in Polk County, Florida in 1901. Horace Duncan and Fred Coker were lynched in Springfield, Missouri in 1906 by a mob of 5,000 people. There were, I want to say, hundreds of these plaques all on the side that are kind of making reference to some of the memorials that are hanging up.
And lynchings were public because they were to terrify the blacks, keep them in their place.
Yeah, and I'm sure some of you have seen some of the old black and white photos of this where it's, it's a spectacle. People have like picnic baskets out and they're dressed in their Sunday best to go see this, kids in tow. And it brings it back to how just ingrained within the culture and within society this was, that someone felt that it was appropriate to bring your children to this kind of spectacle because it's just what the world was like for them at that time.
Did you say this is in Montgomery, Alabama?
This is in Montgomery. This is one of 3 sites that are a part of the Equal Justice Initiative. Brian Stevenson, if you've heard of him, is has been an important voice in that movement. Here you'll see outside they had these slabs, and this one, Chester County, Pennsylvania. I took a picture of it. There was, I think, a desire for counties to come and claim these and bring them back to their own and kind of create a memorial in their own county. So there's a desire for this kind of memorial to spread back into all sorts of different places.
Jason, who funded this project?
So I believe that this was Brian Stevenson's organization, which is the Equal Justice Initiative. And I think there was years and years of trying to raise money. These are millions of dollars to create these. But yeah, the Equal Justice Initiative.
These are all like granite stones.
I don't know. I think they're actually metallic. They seem
Yeah, I
rusted.
can't remember either.
I think they might be.
It's metal.
Yeah,
No.
I think they're intentionally weathered. And there are just powerful sculptures kind of throughout this area as we walked along this site. So yeah, the Legacy Museum from enslavement to mass incarceration. This was an extremely powerful museum. This was one of these 3 sites, the lynching memorial, this, and then the sculpture garden, which I'll get to in a second. This was a really powerful museum. Reminded me of the African American Museum in DC in its scope, in that you start kind of in a place of the origin of slavery in Africa, make your way across the Middle Passage, and then follow up through civil rights. And it's kind of a broad overview of history. It's not as expansive as the DC Museum, but I found it just as powerful and moving because of the way that some of the exhibits were done. A really powerful museum. This is the Freedom Monument Sculpture Park, which is a third location. It's worth noting that if you go to this is kind of the main museum, and then there's the lynching memorial, and then this Freedom. You can go to all of these locations for just $5. Like, I don't know if you guys have ever been to a museum, and I went to we went over the summer. We went down to the Baltimore Aquarium, and an adult, it costs $50 to go into the aquarium now. But you can go to all three of these museums, and they provide transportation between them for just $5. Obviously, this is not a money-making endeavor. It's been financed through a lot of contributions, and the point is to get the word out. This was a beautiful park. We were not allowed to take any pictures in it, except for at this location here, which is the National Monument to Freedom. And what this contains is, if you look very closely, there's just thousands and thousands and thousands of names of individuals. And then they have this database at the end. You can type in your name. And so I was like, well, I'll put in Haldeman. I know all of my ancestors. I'm like 99 point. I did like one of those ancestry DNA things. It was like 99.8% Swiss German. You know, it's like entirely from that region. So in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, like I don't have relatives that are slaves. Clearly, there are someone in this lineage of mine had to have had a relationship in owning slaves or as a part of the slave trade. It's not a coincidence that, you know, all of my family kind of is in this Lancaster County area. And so my history somewhere somehow contains someone who had slaves. The typical form was that slaves would often take the last name of their slave owners. So I just found that interesting. This, well, let me go back here first before we move on. This is jars of soil that have been collected from lynching sites. It makes for a fascinating visual. There was a display about twice as large as this inside the museum, but this was in the center that we could take pictures of because you weren't allowed to take pictures of the museum. But each one of these has a location and a date from where lynching took place, and people have gathered soil from those locations. This is Anthony Ray Hinton. He, if you're familiar with Bryan Stevenson and the book or the movie Just Mercy, Anthony Ray Stevenson was, oh, what did I say? Hinton was wrongfully incarcerated for 28 years because of a crime that he did not commit and was pretty obvious to anyone who would have looked into it. But it was an example of racism that exists within our justice system. So we had an opportunity to hear him speak, which was very moving, and got to spend some time with him that day.
He has written a book, and that book is in our social justice library for you to check out if you'd like to.
What's the name of
The sun does shine.
Yeah, sun does shine. He was on death row for those.
I think we're going to keep moving through. I'll try to be a little quicker here. As we got to in Montgomery, I'm sure we are all familiar with the name of Rosa Parks. And if you look back here as we're moving down historically, this was one of the kind of major launching points for the civil rights movement. That's a statue of Rosa Parks. It's fascinating. In downtown Montgomery, there's this, on one side of the street, we have Rosa Parks here with this sign. On the other side of the street, we have a big sign commemorating where the first telegram was sent beginning the Civil War. And then there's some other markers in Civil War history that are there. So it's a very interesting place.
Still Montgomery?
Yes, in Montgomery that shares some of those historical pieces. This is the Rosa Parks Library and Museum. We didn't actually go in here. This is Dexter Avenue Church. It's right on the main strip leading up to the Capitol building in Montgomery. This was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s church. He was a new pastor in Montgomery. Hadn't been there too long when this decision was made to try and move forward with this Montgomery bus boycott based on the experiences of Rosa Parks, noting that this had been going on for a while. It wasn't as if Rosa Parks was, this seminal moment and everyone was like, oh, this has never happened before. In fact, there had been plenty of other people like Rosa Parks who had done the exact same thing, who were arrested. This was, I don't want to say, I guess you could say it was staged in that, like, there was a plan to set up, to create this situation. Rosa Parks knew what she was doing, to begin this movement. It was creatively and non-violently planned so that this movement could begin. So this is Martin Luther King's church. This is the Holt Street Baptist Church. And this is where the first organizing meeting took place. And so after, and here are some pictures of the desk that apparently when Martin Luther King Jr. got to Holt Street, again, Holt Street was not his church. He was a pastor at a different church, but he was selected to speak to the crowd. And apparently he comes in and spends, 15, 20 minutes writing his remarks on this desk before coming into this space, which has kind of been converted into this museum. They're still in the process of doing it. It's not really an active church in the same way this congregation has moved to a larger sanctuary. But there were thousands of people that gathered at this location, in the room, outside, down in the basement, just huge crowds of people outside the church organizing that. You will not.
Any idea what year? We're talking late 50s,
55.
Yeah, this would have been 50. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
No,
Yeah, 55
yeah,
was the
55.
boycott.
Yeah. I'm gonna play this, and it will sound poor, but I'll explain. This was a recording of Dr. King's speech to that group on that first night of the Montgomery bus boycott. And it was very powerful to sit in there in that space and hear those words and to know that they were spoken, in this space. Yeah, it was a very powerful, I think, moment for all of us to hear that being played. This is the talking a little bit about Freedom Riders, which is a little later in history. Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to share about that. Did you want to say anything about Clinton?
Yes. You probably have not heard of Clinton, Tennessee. Has anybody heard of Clinton, Tennessee? But they were the first to desegregate a school after Brown v. Board. For 2 years, and that decision, Supreme Court decision, was made in 1954. This was 1956, and still no schools had desegregated. They kept saying desegregate. It was a small town. The school district, the principal decided, well, they're going to follow the law, what the law says, so that they would desegregate, and 12 high school students wanted to do that. in 1956. And these students wanted to do that particularly because the town had schools for 1st through 8th grade for whites and another school for blacks. They had a white high school, 9 through 12, but there was no black high school. So if the blacks wanted to go to high school, they had to drive on a ride on the bus 15 miles to Knoxville, where they could go to black high school. So they decided they wanted to come to school in their same community. So these 12 students registered. And there was not really any problem at first. As I said, the principal was okay. The students seemed to accept them okay. But then suddenly things changed. Somebody named Jasper, what's his name? John Casper from New Jersey, of all places, came in as an agitator. And by the end of the year, he made phone calls, he held mass meetings, telling people, you know, this is a terrible thing, that your white students are now in school with these black students. And by the end of that year, there were anti-black slurs, heckling, cross burnings, bombings, KKK night riders. National Guard had to come in with armored personnel carriers and tanks because of the violence.
All because of one agitator from New Jersey.
By the end of 1958, that would be 2 years after they had originally started any school, Clinton High School was destroyed by dynamite. This is the white school. So they dynamited the white school so the blacks could not come there. But then, of course, whites could not come there either. This kind of thing happened like with swimming pools, when they closed down a public swimming pool so that nobody could use the public swimming pool, just so the blacks could. Those kinds of things happened throughout this period. The bomber was never apprehended, did this dynamiting, but no one was injured either. School was not open at the time. You probably know about the Little Rock 9 students that were tried to integrate and did successfully integrate that school in Little Rock, Arkansas. And Clinton has just kind of gotten in the background and forgotten about that. Just some reflection. On our visit there, we were standing, and you can correct me if I have some of this wrong, in front of that brick school building. It wasn't a big building at all. That had once been bombed. And we looked down over, it was up on a hill, and we looked down over a very pleasant valley. The houses built down the slope. And it was in the valley where the black community was. So if you can imagine these 12 black students having to walk up that hill to that school, when people didn't want them to do that. The courage it took. The courage it took all children who desegregated schools. Adults put a lot of pressure, a lot of responsibility on those children to have that done. Eddie Keith was one of those in Clinton, in the school in South Carolina. Some were even shot at while they were waiting for the buses. There was a minister in Clinton who wanted to help. He wanted to protect these children. He walked with the children to school, and he was severely beaten and apparently traumatized for the rest of his life. And then I think of outsider agitators coming into our school district. What do we do? How do we respond nonviolently in those situations? changing hearts and minds. So maybe, well, definitely I will come to the Kingian Nonviolence Weekend in October here at this church. Hopefully you will too.
One of the things I think that was, particularly resonant to me, and it wasn't a new fact, and we all know this, was that the civil rights movement, and we'll be talking more about this when we get to Birmingham and in Selma, as we saw here with the Montgomery bus boycott, the epicenter for this organization was within churches. And it's fascinating to think about the role and the responsibility that these religious institutions had. These Black churches were the heart of the community, and were the epicenter for this decision-making process. And it wasn't merely just the location of, this activist group that met like in the basement and had no connection to the church. The values and the principles of nonviolence, of being true to following Jesus, can be seen throughout this movement. It really helped to give a backbone and kind of a moral compass to this civil rights movement. And thinking about, our role as a community of faith, what does that look like for us? And there's often this really tricky line between trying to, particularly within the Church of Brethren, but trying to be faithful to our calling to follow Jesus, and how does that intersect with civil responsibilities as citizens, and how do those things conflate, and how are we influenced by our faith when seeking to be faithful to our calling as Christians? So that's something that was continually resonant with me. We think about these leaders in this movement, like Dr. Martin Luther King as a reverend, and so many of these other faith leaders were the leaders for the civil rights movement. And I think that that's a powerful thing for us to remember. We got about halfway through what we wanted to cover. We made it through, I think, most of what we wanted to do today, but we did want to leave some time. We have about 10 minutes left for questions, for comments, noting that we'll be getting to some other stuff next Sunday as well. But yeah, what are some thoughts, reactions?
So these weren't all people from Brethren churches?
No, I think we were
Mostly
the
Baptist and AME.
only
Okay.
Church of the Brethren.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, in the Thriving Together
Probably, yeah,
program.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think we're the only church of the, I think Harrisburg First was in the first cohort, but we're the only COB church. And it's the greater Harrisburg area. So most churches are kind of in Harrisburg, that region. I think we're geographically the farthest one away. right?
Although there's
But-
Dillsburg and.
Yeah, Dillsburg,
Carlisle.
Carlisle also.
And were a lot of people on the trip of color then?
I would say it's pretty split evenly.
Probably more whites than blacks, but
Yeah.
it's.
Yeah, so there's definitely what you would, Black churches, and some white churches. There's some churches probably that might be more diverse, but I would say most people were coming from primarily Black congregations or primarily white congregations. Yeah, Don.
You'll have to help me on this, but there is a trail
Yeah,
south.
sure.
What's the meaning of that trail and where does it fit in here?
So maybe you're referring to like the Civil Rights Trail. Is that what you're talking
I
about?
don't know what I'm talking
Okay.
about.
So
I just know it's a trail.
Yeah.
And it's important.
Yeah, so I guess there's two ways to think about this. One, what I'm thinking about off the top of my head is that recently, probably in this, probably in the last half century, as a set of historical markers of places of significance that have been identified, and you can follow a civil rights trail, which is basically like a bus tour, but there's so many more places that you could go along this marking. Similar things probably exist for like the Civil War and things like that, Civil War trail that goes through different markers.
There is a book now that I picked up at one of the places we stopped at. It's called The Civil Rights Trail. It's in our social justice library now. And it has a nice timeline at the beginning of it. And then specific, each page, beautiful photographs too of the places along the Civil Rights Trail. It's not a physical trail.
Yeah, right.
Is this bus tour being done now also, or was this a one-time thing?
So this was a one-time thing for our Thriving Together program, but the man who took this tour, his name's Todd. He's led a number of these bus tours. I think we were like his second or third one this year, maybe even. And I think he has one more. So he might do like 3 a summer. So they happen frequently. But there's also, I mean, there's all sorts of people who would organize these kind of all these kind of bus tours throughout the South. Yeah. Answers.
Kind of a personal question. What things did you both do to handle
Mhm.
whichever process it or a little bit or?
Yeah, it's a good question because it's heavy. And the days ended up being quite long. There were times we wouldn't get back to the hotel until after 8. And we were doing a lot of driving. And there wasn't a lot of downtime in that, like when we were on the bus driving, we would be watching these documentaries or dramatize, like Emmett Till, a movie about Emmett Till came out a couple years ago. So these are all just really heavy topics. They did provide some opportunity for us to kind of debrief some of these experiences within small groups. And I think that was particularly helpful that one night when we all met together, but it happened a couple times. And there would be some promptings and some things for us to think through. But there's almost no way to do it. So yeah, I think aside from just structured opportunities, we kind of had to process on our own at night.
I tried to journal, personal reflections. I did some poetry, but towards the end of the week, I was so tired. And there was one night, I think the whole world was Microsofted. Something had happened to Microsoft. Anyway, we got to our hotel and we had to wait and wait and wait till we could get to our rooms. It was like 11 o'clock till we actually got to our rooms. But so at that point, you know, I just stopped doing that kind of thing. But that's a good question.
Julie, you talked about capturing the Africans and shipping them over by boats. I just remembered I had an interesting experience. I'm from Boston. And I was stopping by Mystic Seaport one time years ago and was wandering around. And they had this giant piece of lumber in the shop that they had brought in from Africa. It was a purple heartwood. And they were laying the keel for the replica slave ship that was later in a movie. And it was a really powerful experience. They were doing it by hand with adze, you know, like the old days, laying this giant piece of wood for the keel of the slave boat that was then used in this movie. And talking to the workmen about that was fascinating. And that movie came out, and I can't remember the name of the movie. But
Is it Amistad?
Amistad, no, it was the ship Amistad, that's correct. And they were building it at Mystic, and it's really powerful memory.
I thought I heard that there's some movement to create some type of slave labor memorial in Washington, DC. Did they talk about that at all, or did you hear anything like that?
I didn't hear anything about that, but I think, not on this trip, but I think I've heard similar things too.
Like the Vietnam War memorial or those, something like that?
Knowing that so many of the buildings that are in DC would have been created utilizing.
When I first saw that picture about the memorial in Jefferson at the
University of Virginia.
university, yes, it reminded me of the wall.
Mhm. Yeah.
Actually, we saw another memorial. I can't remember where it was. Maybe in Montgomery that had the water flowing over it.
And Albany, yeah.
Oh, Albany was that? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And that was designed by the same person who designed the Vietnam Memorial in Washington.
A huge part of this is creating opportunities for individuals to be able to reflect and to remember. It's why the memorials are created. It's why museums are made. So many of the things that we visited weren't necessarily, well, some of them were the actual sites where these things happened, but lots of the places where we went were either museums or memorials or individuals who were sharing their story. And this really intentional effort to say, we are not going to pretend this didn't happen. We are not going to act like we had no responsibility in this. We're going to say it like it is, and we're going to make sure that people remember this.
And
'Cause-
then move forward.
and then move forward, because it is, I think, our tendency, particularly if you're embarrassed about something, and this is a blemish on American history, to kind of just pretend it didn't happen, and to just want to move on and be like, you know what, we'll just pretend it, isn't it better if we just pretend it didn't happen? We can just move on holding hands together. But that's not really, not a fair.
I have a question for you all. If you were of an age when some of this happened, do you remember where you were? At what point in your life you were at this time? What were you hearing about? Were you hearing about it at all? Any reflections that way?
I think most of us over 70.
Debbie? Debbie?
I was gonna say, I grew up in Massachusetts. And there were two sisters, Black sisters, who lived there. It's the only time I ever saw or was aware, really. And in the church that I belonged to then in Massachusetts, it was a Methodist church, and we wanted to do an exchange student. And we picked one who came from the Congo. And he came over and he went to high school with us. And I remember one of the biology teachers class, he came up and he said something to me about how nice it was, he thought, that our church would have done that and brought him over so that he could experience what it was like.
And yet, and that's very important and needs to continue to be done, but it's different than somebody who grew up in enslaved culture.
Yeah.
Those African Americans are different from the Africans we exchange with now.
Yeah.
And they're within that community. There's a very clear understanding of that difference.
And then he decided to go on to college down in West Virginia, of all places. But I took a trip down there to see him. And we were walking down the street in the town that was there, side by side. And we kept getting looks. And he looked over at me and he said, "Why do they keep looking at us?" And I was like, it was just totally lost. But it was a very good experience to see in person. And then we wound up living in Washington DC for a while. Hello. Right about the time when Martin Luther King was. So it's just one of those things. I don't know.
Julie, just a thought. I grew up in Boston, just south of Boston, and I remember I got to high school in 1968. Just we started working. We were going through the busing crisis of Boston. Judge Garrity had mandated that they mix the schools, and there was just an uproar and like a civil war going on in the Boston community. And I remember I had a customer who was a young lady, South Boston High School District, and she spent her whole day with the state police inside, keeping the parents outside and the kids inside, and keeping the two apart. And it was the parents that were the problem in South Boston. That was the epicenter of the busing crisis during Garrity. you know, was famous at the time and eventually settled down. But that was like 1968. So many years after what you're talking.
Yeah, and I would encourage you this week, because we're gonna be back here together, to think about that question. Both about historically, where you've been, what your experience has been with some of these moments in history. And projecting forward, what our role and responsibility is now, at this time and in this place. We're out of time for today, but thank you for
Thank you.
being here, and we'll pick up next week. Thanks.
Yeah, we